In the collections of the Buffalo, New York Historical Society is a memoir of Isaac Roach, which he called a diary, written in 1834 and recounting his experiences during the War of 1812. Isaac Roach was a native of Philadelphia and joined the Army as a second lieutenant when the war began. In early September 1812, as a part of Colonel Winfield Scott's regiment, he marched for the Canadian frontier. October 5th, he reached Buffalo. The tale he tells is an interesting one. Not wishing to be idle, I requested Colonel Scott to offer my services to Lieutenant Elliott of our Navy, who was fitting out a small vessel at Black Rock for service on Lake Erie. Colonel Scott no doubt telling him I had a desire to get into business. When the colonel returned to our encampment, our battalion was ordered down to Black Rock to protect our vessels, and I was informed my desire to smell gunpowder was soon to be gratified. Lieutenant Elliott, thinking his outfit too tedious, fancied two of the enemy's vessels already equipped, and riding at anchor in apparent security close under their cannon of Fort Erie, at the outlet of Lake Erie, and directly in sight of us. Lieutenant Elliott informed me he intended to embark at night in two rowboats and cut out the two brigs. Both of them were armed, but we must have them as they would add to our intended force on Lake Erie. He was much pleased with my offer to go with him, and to take 50 men from our regiment. It was arranged that I was to go in the boat with him, and to attack the largest vessel. She was called the Detroit, formerly the U.S. Brig Adams, and was well manned with small arms and pikes, carrying a 4-iron 6-pound cannon. The other brig was the Caledonia, not so well armed. An incident occurred previous to embarkation, very flattering to a young and untried officer, but exemplifying the attachments of officers and men to an adjutant who is zealous to do his duty. When Colonel Scott paraded the battalion, and I read the order, directing the detail of 50 men to be placed under the command of Adjutant Roach for the purpose of attacking the enemy's vessels, then in sight and moored for safety under their battery. The colonel, informing the battalion no one could go without expecting a hard fight, and advising that none but brave and discreet men should go as so much depended on their coolness. He was disposed to give some of our lads an opportunity of tilting with our enemy, and directed that the volunteers at the word march should step 4 paces in the front of the line. When I ordered volunteers to the front march, I believe every man and officer all rushed forward. This was a proud moment to me, and could not but feel that some of this burst of zeal arose as well from confidence in myself as of patriotism. Turning round to Colonel Scott, I found him delighted with this evidence of spirit, and said, "Dress your line, sir, and select your volunteers." This was not easily done, for while going down the line with my sergeant major, every face was pushed forward with, "Can I go, sir? Take me, Mr. Adjutant. Don't forget McGee. I'm a Philadelphia boy," and a great variety of such expression, making it difficult to select when all deserved to go, and I was compelled to take 60 men. The battalion was dismissed. Volunteers to remain. When a new feeling was to be produced, my gallant friends the officers all gathered round me. Captain Towson and Barker, Lieutenants McDonough, Davis, Stewart and Hook, and even our little surgeon, Dr. Neer, one and all insisted on going under my command. Was not this enough to flatter one? Would not this make anyone proud? Towson and Barker were so determined on going, I began to think our tea party would be broken up, as Colonel Scott and Lieutenant Elliott both declared no one should go to rank me, Towson went to his tent and wrote his resignation, sent it to the colonel, and volunteered as a citizen. This would not do. I begged for one of the captains to go. The colonel consented. Mr. Elliott said they should not go in the boat with him. Towson won the chance to go and went with Sailing Master George Watts in the second boat, who had orders to board the smaller vessel. Night came, every man ready, arms in order. Coffee for 2 and pistols for 4, the boats prepared, oars muffled, and grappling irons at hand. Sailors skipping about as merry as crickets. A parcel of tar, who had been marched from Albany, had just arrived and were glad to see a vessel again. About 8 o'clock we hailed out of Sconodles Creek and tracked our boats silently up against the rapid current of the Niagara to the mouth of Buffalo Creek. Here we were to embark, to row up into Lake Erie, where there was no current, and descend to the attack on the British side, where we would be least suspected. A detachment of the 5th Infantry here joined us under Ensign Priesman. The tide on the bar being low, we were obliged to wade up to our shoulders and push the boats over the bar of Buffalo Creek. This was one of our cold sleety evenings in October, when the water of Lake Erie is too cold to bathe in, and we were obliged to sit in our wet clothes for 3 hours in a small boat, and not allowed to even laugh to keep ourselves warm. We rowed very quietly up the lake several miles before we crossed, and then came down upon friend John Bull in hopes of catching him napping, but when we neared him we found him wide awake. There was a fire on board the Detroit in the camboose, which we steered by. Our boats were steered like a whaleboat with a long oar. When within a half-mile of the brig, Lieutenant Elliott directed our men not to fire, but to be silent. I told the sailor, who was steering, to give me the helm and get ready his grapple. We were now within musket range, when I headed for her forefoot and rounded to, so as to board her head to tide. They now hailed from the brig, and immediately fired all their muskets, and we received a second volley before we were alongside, as I preferred laying alongside securely, and not to miss our game as the sailing master did in the other boat under the enemy's stern. They lost several men, and undoubtedly would have sheered off if Captain Towson had not ordered the men to hail up alongside, board and carry her. In our boat we were no sooner alongside than well secured, and everyone mounted on board. Lieutenant Elliott and myself boarded in the brig's main rigging on the quarter-deck. The captain aimed a severe blow at Elliott's head, but in total dark struck on one side and knocked his hat overboard. In 5 minutes we were in possession, and our prisoners driven below. The hatchways were secured. Some hands were sent aloft to loose the topsails, whilst I examined the brig's guns and found them loaded. We had surprised the crew, and they had not time to fire them. I ordered them all hauled over to the starboard side next Fort Erie, to be ready for an attack from the shore, but upon bringing up the second mate he denied having any ammunition on board, and not until he was brought to by some hard threats did he agree to show us where his chest was with 42 rounds of cartridge. Until this period the British on shore knew not which party had conquered, and they now hailed to know. Lieutenant Elliott ordered the fire on deck extinguished and the topsails loosed. When we were hailed again they said they would fire if we got under way. I told Mr. Elliott my guns were all ready. When they opened the ball, all the quick match I had was a bundle of candles held by my guard in the companionway. Whiz comes a shot over our heads. John Bull always aims too high. This went about 20 feet over us and ricocheted. Our shore was lined with friends anxiously waiting for our moments. The first shot fired from Fort Erie after the declaration of war killed Major Keiler of the militia whilst sitting on horseback. Bang! Went my battery of 6-pounders. Up helm, boys! Stand by the cable with an axe. Away! And now, we get the battery guns on us. Our neighbor Watts and Towson and the other brig were underway, and this served to distract the enemy's fire. The day dawned, and with it came a light breeze of wind. We had hopes of getting up against the current into Lake Erie. All my cartridges were expended, and now we had quietly to take the penetrating arguments of the fort to stop us. Excuse shot telling, as we had to come nearer the shore. These guns I fired were the first directed against the enemy on the Niagara. The winds became lighter, and in place of getting up into the lake out of the current and gunshot, we were compelled to sheer over to our shore, and in our attempts to get into the harbor, both our prizes grounded. All the prisoners were sent on shore. The Caledonia, which was full of furs, was unloaded. Preparation was made to burn the Detroit that night. The general, commanding, ordered Major Chambers to set fire to her, the policy of which I could admire. The Caledonia was saved and added to our fleet and aided the gallant Perry in his victory. On mustering our forces, we found 2 officers wounded and about 10 men killed and wounded. Our brother officers on shore praising us extravagantly, and we well satisfied to have brought ourselves back in a whole skin. Now when it is remembered that our country had been at peace for 30 years and all her old soldiers dead or very aged, scarcely a man in our expedition had ever faced an enemy, and that this was the attack of raw recruits on veterans. Without flattery, it may be said to have been a handsome affair. For this action by an act of Congress, Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott was promoted over 30 other lieutenants to the rank of Master Commandant.